bismillaahir-Rahmaanir-raheem. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Prior to the last break, we didn't have a question and answer session. So, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we'll go through some of the questions that were brought forward quickly, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So, the first question states, Assalamu alaikum, can we recite the Qur'an at the time of period? Can we hold the Qur'an at that specific time? So the sister is asking that is it permissible to recite the Qur'an during her menstrual cycle? And secondly, is it permissible to hold the Qur'an during that menstrual cycle? As for the recitation of the Qur'an, then obviously both of these, first of all, both of these questions, or the answers to both of these questions, one needs to understand that there is a valid difference of opinion in the answers, that you'll find some scholars who go towards one opinion and scholars who go towards another. But to summarize it, and without going into too much detail, as for the recitation of the Qur'an, then bi'ithnillahi ta'ala, inshallah, there is no harm in reciting the Qur'an while a sister is in her menstrual cycle. As for touching the Qur'an, then there's a stronger difference of opinion over here. And to stay on the safe side, what the sister should do is wear some sort of covering, either some gloves or have a sheet between herself and the Qur'an. This is just something to be on the safe side. But like we mentioned, there is a difference of opinion. Some scholars have said it is permissible for her to touch it, some said it is not. But again, to be on the safe side, she should put a barrier between herself and the Qur'an, something like gloves or a sheet. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. The second question states, what should be the strategy for us dealing with halal and haram and buying products of regular use? What should we look for out of research, and how should we verify something has undergone istihala? Any rulings on common products like soap, toothpaste, bread, ice cream, deodorant, creams, etc.? And then the rest is crossed out. The general rule in food products is that it is permissible until it is proven haram. And this is the same thing in everything with the exception of ibadah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made our lives facilitated for us. So when it comes for food, the general case scenario, it is permissible until a person has a reason to think that there is something haram in it. Now, let's just say you come across an item, let's just say maybe cheese or bread that has rennet in it or has mono and diglycerides in it. Now these products can be derived from unquestionably haram sources, the likes of pig and let's just say the likes of pig, and they can come from substances which are sometimes halal and sometimes haram, the likes of meat which are from cows and from sheep, and other than that, depending on whether it has been slaughtered properly or not. Now, when these products are composed, I guess that's the most appropriate word, is when they're composed and put together and compiled, they go through a chemical transformation. And again, it's a very detailed process, but amongst three madhahib, this chemical change that the components go through, it purifies the substance. So things like rennet and mono and diglycerides, vast majority of the times they go through this chemical change and they are thus become purified of the original substance that was in them. An example of this, or to get a clearer example of this, is you can take the example of vinegar. Vinegar is a form of alcohol and can lead to a form of alcohol, and its origin can be from like grape juice or from dates or anything other than that. So this chemical process or this metamorphosis at times can purify things. So amongst three of the schools of thought, amongst the Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, and the madhab of Imam Ahmad, they agree that this chemical change purifies it, and thus it is no longer an issue. Whereas in the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, they say that this chemical change doesn't bring about purification, thus it stays on its original form of impurity. So the general case scenario is, to simplify everything, that if a person can go to a halal meat market and can go to a halal grocery store owned by Muslims who are trustworthy, it's better to go there. But if he's unable to do that and he's forced to go to his local grocery store, like, I don't know what you have here, but in Quebec we have IGA and Loblaws, and I've seen the No Frills over here as well.
Yeah, Maxi also.
And Maxi as well, and any other grocery store that you may have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't make this life extremely difficult for you. So those things which you need, like cheese and bread, you have the benefit of the doubt that inshallah is permissible for you. Products like meat within of itself, then this is a more debatable issue, which again I know every single person likes to ask, can we eat the meat of the people of the book in this land or not? Inshallah, the next speaker that comes, you can ask him that question, inshallah. But as for myself, I won't get into the details of it, as it requires a lot of explanation. But Allah, in terms of other things like the soaps and the cheeses and the bread, things that are regular day use, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made this deen easy, and He doesn't need to get into too much detail when looking into these issues, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. As for the third question, the questioner mentions that there are people who challenge the Muslims to show miracles of the Qur'an. Please advise us how to answer this question. The miracles of Islam are many. One is the advency of the Prophet ﷺ, as we're going to be discussing shortly, is that the Prophet ﷺ was an unlettered man, that the Prophet ﷺ didn't know how to read or write. So for him to come with the Qur'an, and again this is historically documented, that the Prophet ﷺ didn't know how to read or write. So for an unlettered man to come with the Qur'an, this is a big miracle. Then the Prophet ﷺ splitting the Qur'an and the Qur'an documenting this is a big miracle. Then you have the scientific miracles of the Qur'an, which was published by Dr. Maurice Bukai, that he published the scientific miracles of the Qur'an. And then you have some of the books that talk about the other miracles of the Qur'an. So all this, these are miracles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted. But again, this should not be our general approach to convince people about Islam. As we mentioned in yesterday's class, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He created a fitrah for people, or a natural disposition that all of us were created upon. Muslim or kafir, we have this natural disposition where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made something inside of us that we naturally incline towards worshipping one Lord. And if you can ignite that fitrah inside the person, then inshallah the person will seek out Islam for themselves. The only matter is reigniting that or kindling that fire of seeking the truth inside the person. And once you rekindle it, then inshallah that makes your task more easy. And again, in terms of miracles, there are numerous amount of miracles. It's up to the person to go back to the books and study them and bring them forth. But again, I wouldn't advise this to be the core of your discussion in giving da'wah, but rather it should be who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam being sent to all of mankind, and then you can talk about the Qur'an, some of the miracles in the Qur'an, but don't make it the focal point of your discussion. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Now, people may notice, why am I being so brief in answering the questions? We have about 20 hours of material which we're trying to cover in a total of 6 hours. So spending time on questions that aren't pertinent to the discussion obviously takes away from it. But likewise, at the same time, to not answer those questions is also quite rude. So now, getting back to the discussion at hand, we mentioned some facts prior to the break about the Qur'an, and we talked about the number of verses. And one of the brothers came up to me and he asked me, the number of verses that you mentioned, does this include the Basmallah as an ayah, or does it not include the Basmallah as an ayah? So I thought it would be an ideal opportunity to bring this up now. With consensus, the Basmallah is only part of the Qur'an in one ayah, and that's in Surah An-Naml, ayah number 30. This is with consensus, that it is part of the Qur'an only in one ayah. All the scholars have agreed to this, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّهُ مِن سُلَيْمَانَ وَإِنَّهُ bismillaahir-Rahmaanir-raheem. That indeed this is from Sulaiman, and it says bismillaahir-Rahmaanir-raheem. Then the second strongest scenario is that the Basmalah is part of Surah Al-Fatiha. This is the second strongest location where a lot of the scholars have come to agree that the Basmalah is part of Surah Al-Fatiha, but upon further review, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, the correct opinion is that the Basmalah is not part of Surah Al-Fatiha. Again, this is a lot of discussion, but we're just mentioning opinions for the time being. Now, as for the rest of the surahs, then the more correct opinion is that it is not part of any other surah. So putting Surah Al-Fatiha aside, it's not part of any other surah. And again, with consensus, it's not part of Surah At-Tawbah. You'll notice when you read the Qur'an at the beginning of Surah At-Tawbah, even as something which is mustahab for those scholars who say it doesn't mention the Basmalah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam agreed that it wasn't to be mentioned before Surah At-Tawbah. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala mentions the opinion that the wisdom behind this is that it's a continuation of the surah before it. That Surah Al-Anfal and Surah At-Tawbah, you'll notice that the themes are quite similar to each other. That they discuss common themes, and in actuality it's just a continuation of one surah to the next with a separation in between. So there was no need for another Basmalah. Another opinion is that when you mention bismillaahir-Rahmaanir-raheem, that in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, how it's commonly translated, it isn't appropriate to the beginning of Surah At-Tawbah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from the mushrikeen. So we mentioned that this is another opinion where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mention the Basmalah at the beginning of Surah At-Tawbah. Now, continuing with our discussion at hand, we reach the topic of the compilation of the Qur'an. The compilation of the Qur'an went through three main phases before it reached our time, and we'll only focus on those three phases. There's an actual fourth phase, which can be divided into many other phases, which is from the time of Uthman until our time today. But bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we won't be touching on that, because again there's a lot of time and there's very little benefit pertaining to it. So we'll take the first three time periods, the first of them being during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how the Qur'an was preserved during that time. The second being during the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and the third of them being during the time of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So these are the three time frames that we will be discussing. Now, before getting into this, one needs to look at the historical context and the way society was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So firstly, we mentioned several times previously that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took it upon himself to preserve the Qur'an. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he will preserve the Qur'an. Secondly, we need to understand that as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised us this, we should have no doubt as to the authenticity of the Qur'an and how accurate the Qur'an is in relation to when it was first revealed. That we believe that the Qur'an is just as it was revealed, without a single letter or vowel or word missing. Now, thirdly, how was society at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? We mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ was unlettered, or commonly known as illiterate. Now, this wasn't something unique to the Prophet ﷺ, but rather it was something very general, that the Arabs of the past, they may have not known how to read and write, yet they maintained their eloquency through their speech and through their memorization. If you refer back to some of the books of history, they mention that during the time of the Hajj seasons, obviously Hajj was something known from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, that people would come to the Kaaba and would perform Hajj, or the pilgrimage, and visit the Kaaba. And prior to this season, they would have a competition amongst the poets, which they would call the Fair of Uqad. And in this fair, they would gather all the poets, and all the poets would come together and come up with the best poetry or the most beautiful poetry in describing the Kaaba and the season of Hajj. So we understood that even though they may have been unlettered, meaning that they didn't know how to read or write, they still maintained eloquence in their language. And another fact to keep in mind is that there are some reports in history that when the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, there were only 17 people who knew how to read and write. This is again some facts that are documented in the books of history, that there were only 17 people who knew how to read and write during the time of the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca. So now, how did this affect the Prophet ﷺ, his companions, and the preservation of the Qur'an? As we notice that as Islam progressed and more people came into Islam, if there were only 17 people who knew how to read and write, it is a possible assumption that the companions who first accepted Islam, not all of them knew how to read or write. So thus there was no written compilation or preservation of the Qur'an. Most of it was done orally and through memorization. Now, that having been said, what is the first written preservation of the Qur'an that we know of? We have all heard the famous story of the acceptance of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu and how he became Muslim. And this is through when Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu visited his sister who was married to Khabbab ibn al-Arath, and he had with him a transcript of Surah Taha. So Umar came into their house and he's banging on the door and he says, "What are you reciting?" when he heard the Qur'an being recited. So as they opened the door, they hid the sahifa or the scrolls that they have of the Qur'an. So then Umar said, "I want to see what was being recited," and they brought out the verses from Surah Taha. So this is the first documented case that we have of the Qur'an being preserved in a written form, and this was in the 6th year of the Hijrah. Now a point of discussion arises over here is that when you look at the chain of narration of this story of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu accepting Islam, if you look at the chain of narration, it seems that the chain of narration is weak. But another thing to keep in mind is that those stories that have no relation or even correlation to Aqidah or to rulings of Islam, the chain of narration doesn't need to be authentic or as strong to relate such stories. And this was an opinion of some of the scholars, but rather the majority of the scholars who narrated the seerah, that as long as it doesn't need this, as long as you don't derive ahkam from it and you're not mentioning anything pertaining to Aqidah, then the chain of narration doesn't need to be as strong. So that having been said, how did the Prophet ﷺ go about preserving the Qur'an? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the scenario of the Prophet ﷺ in Surah Al-Qiyamah, ayahs 16 and 17. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and do not move your tongue rapidly in reciting the Qur'an, but rather it is upon us to compile and to recite the Qur'an. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning how the Prophet ﷺ used to be very fearful of forgetting the Qur'an, and he was very fearful that the ummah might not preserve the Qur'an. So he would constantly be repeating the Qur'an upon his tongue very rapidly out of fear that the Qur'an might be lost. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consoles the Prophet ﷺ and says that it is upon us to collect it and recite it as well. And this is also seen through the large amounts of Qur'an that the Prophet ﷺ used to recite during his night prayers. In the narration of Hudayfa and in one of the narrations of Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, you see that the Prophet ﷺ recited in one raka'ah Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Imran and Surah Al-Nisa, and not in that particular order. It was actually Al-Baqarah, Al-Nisa, then Al-Imran in one raka'ah. He recited this much Qur'an. So we see that the Prophet ﷺ was constantly and consistently reciting the Qur'an so that he wouldn't forget it. And likewise, it is narrated from Ubadah ibn Samit radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the noble and illustrious companion, that each time someone would enter into Islam, the Prophet ﷺ would allocate for him a companion to teach him the Qur'an. So this was the first obligation after he was taught the Shahada and he performed his other obligations. The first thing that he was taught was to read the Qur'an and to memorize the Qur'an. Obviously, reading the Qur'an was known as the Qur'an was there in their language, meaning that it was understood. And then the Prophet ﷺ taught them to memorize it. So as time went on, this is how the Prophet ﷺ ensured that the Qur'an would be preserved. That through his own fear, he would constantly recite it. And then when someone would enter into Islam, he would make sure that someone was there to teach them the Qur'an. And likewise, amongst his companions, this was the thing that he taught them the most. That a lot of the times you'll see when a companion narrates a dua, especially the likes of the dua of qunut or the dua known as Sayyid al-Istighfar, they mention in the beginning of these hadith that the Prophet ﷺ taught us this as he would teach us the Qur'an, meaning with the same enthusiasm, with the same passion, with the same fear of it being lost as he used to teach us the Qur'an, meaning that he would repeat it to us with patience and make sure we had it letter by letter. So now, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a famous incident known as the Bir al-Ma'una, or the well of al-Ma'una. And what happened over here was that the Prophet ﷺ took and selected the most knowledgeable of his companions, and he sent them to Bir al-Ma'una, and from there they were to allocate to different lands in Arabia or different cities and villages. As the Prophet ﷺ had been sent a letter that, people are interested in Islam, they want to learn the Qur'an, can you please send us people who will teach it to us? So the Prophet ﷺ selected 70 of his noblest companions, the ones who had learned the Qur'an, and he sent them to Bir al-Ma'una, where they were to be received by a caravan. But what ended up happening over here was that the Prophet ﷺ was tricked. This was actually an assault upon the companions, and 70 of the companions were killed during this attempt of giving da'wah. And this was in the 4th year of the Hijrah. So we see that 70 of the companions who had memorized a portion of the Qur'an or had memorized all of the Qur'an died during Bir al-Ma'una. And a similar scenario took place during the time of Abu Bakr, known as the Battle of Yamama, which we will discuss later on. Now the question arises, this having been said that 70 companions of the Prophet ﷺ were killed at Bir al-Ma'una who knew the Qur'an. How many people actually existed? How many Hufaz were there actually from the companions? In a narration mentioned by Anas ibn Malik in Sahih al-Bukhari, he mentioned that there were only 4 Hufaz during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Ubay ibn Ka'ab, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Zayd ibn Thabit,